They called me too dumb for $5 million. I found $200 million right under their noses. My old man died on a Tuesday. Heart attack. Quick and clean, which is probably how he would have wanted it. The service was scheduled for Saturday, and I drove 12 hours straight from Colorado to make it. Still had diesel smell on my clothes from the last haul. When I pulled into the funeral home parking lot, I knew something was off. There was this old Peterbilt sitting where the hearse should have been. Not just any Peterbilt, either. Dad's 1987 model. The one he bought used in '89 and drove until his knees finally gave out in 2003. Chrome was polished to a mirror shine. Someone had detailed that truck like it was going to a show. Turns out, Dad's had specific instructions. No fancy hearse. No black Cadillac with little flags. He wanted his last ride to be in the cab of that Peterbilt, the same way he'd spent 40 years of his life. I stood there in my only decent suit, the one that smelled like mothballs because I only wore it to funerals and the occasional wedding. The jacket was tight across my shoulders. Driving a truck for 4 decades will do that to you. Builds muscle in places you didn't know existed. I walked up to that Peterbilt and did what felt natural. Checked the tire pressure. Sounds weird, right? Your dad's coffin is loaded in the sleeper cab, and you're crouching down with a tire gauge. But that's what truckers do. We check the tires. It's reflex. Old Jimmy Patterson came up, shook my hand with that firm grip only truckers have. Told me about a run he and Dad did to Seattle back in '94. Got snowed in at a truck stop in Montana for 3 days. They played cards with a group of drivers hauling Christmas trees. Won enough money to pay for a steak dinner and a tank of fuel. More guys showed up, guys with callous hands and worn jeans, despite it being a funeral. They all had stories. Every single one of them gripped my hand like they meant it, looked me in the eye, and shared some memory of my old man that I'd never heard. That's when it hit me. These were Dad's real friends. Not the business associates who sent flowers. Not the corporate partners who donated to charities in his name. These were the guys who knew him when he was covered in grease, when he was dead tired after a 30-hour haul, when he was just another driver trying to make a living. I found myself remembering this one time when I was 12. Summer of '79. Dad took me on a run to California, and I slept in the bunk behind his seat while he drove through the night. The engine's rumble was like a lullaby. I'd wake up sometimes, see the darkness outside, the endless highway lit by headlights, and feel completely safe. That truck was home in a way our actual house never quite was. My sister, Emily, stood about 30 feet away with her son, Chet. I called him Ty Clip in my head, though never to his face. Kid was 29, fresh MBA from some fancy school, and he wore these expensive suits with perfectly matched ties. Even at a funeral, he looked like he was about to close a business deal. Emily was on her phone, at our father's funeral. I could hear fragments of her conversation. Something about rebranding, about optimizing logistics chains, about quarterly projections. She caught me looking and gave his apologetic shrug. Like I should understand that business doesn't stop for death. Chet was nodding along, occasionally typing something on his phone. They both looked completely out of place, like designer shoes in a muddy parking lot. And maybe that's unfair. Maybe I was being bitter. But watching them stand apart from all these drivers, these men who actually knew Dad, it felt wrong. The service itself was simple. Pastor said some words. Emily gave a eulogy that sounded like it was written by a corporate PR team. Talked about Dad's business acumen, his forward-thinking strategies, his legacy of innovation. All true, I guess. But she didn't mention the time he stopped to help a stranded driver in Wyoming during a blizzard, or how he always had a thermos of coffee to share truck stops, or how he knew every good diner between Maine and Texas. I didn't speak. Couldn't trust myself to get through it. After they lowered him into the ground, I stayed behind, watched the workers fill in the dirt. One of them recognized me, said Dad had given him his first driving job back in the '90s. We stood there in silence for a while, just watching. A week later, I got the call from Mr. Haynes, the family lawyer. Come in for the will reading. Bring a pen. Haynes had been our family lawyer since before I was born. He taught me how to fish when I was 8, took me and Dad out to this lake in Pennsylvania. Caught my first base that day. Haynes was the one who helped Dad start Connolly and Son Logistics back in 1985, drew up all the incorporation papers, made sure everything was legal and proper. So when I walked into his office that following Tuesday, I expected something straightforward. Dad was a simple guy. He'd probably split things down the middle between me and Emily, maybe leave some money to a charity or two. The office hadn't changed much since I was a kid. Same with paneling. Same leather chairs that creak when you sat down. Same smell of old books and furniture polish. Haynes was behind his desk, looking older than I remembered. Gray hair, deeper wrinkles, but same kind eyes. Emily and Chet were already there, sitting on the right side of the room. I took the left. On the table was his crystal water pitcher, the kind you see in fancy restaurants. And next to it was a stack of papers that looked thicker than the Bible. Legal documents, bound with those brass fasteners that lawyers love. Haynes cleared his throat and gave me this look. Paternal. Concerned. The kind of look that should have made me feel better, but somehow didn't. He told me that Dad had been worried about me. Now, let me pause here. That phrase, worried about me, should have been my first warning. I'd been driving trucks for 40 years. Started when I was 18, right after high school. Did 2 tours in Vietnam first, came back, and the only thing that made sense was a road. The endless highway, the independence, the rhythm of it all. I'd built a good life. Owned my truck outright, had money saved, stayed healthy. What was there to worry about? But Haynes kept going. He explained that Dad's will included a choice for me. Option 1. I could receive my share of the company, about $5 million in stock value, but it would be placed in a trust managed by Chet. The reasoning, according to these papers Haynes was reading, was that I was a man of the road, not a man of numbers. I didn't have experience with corporate management, with quarterly reports, with shareholder meetings. The trust would protect me from making poor financial decisions, ensure I had steady income without the stress of business operations. Option 2, I could take what Dad called my special inheritance, a piece of land in West Texas, 160 acres of nothing, according to the property assessment, appraised value of $50,000. The land came with an old trailer, a water well that probably didn't work, and a view of absolutely nothing but dirt and sky. Haynes put his hand on my shoulder. The gesture felt rehearsed. He told me he'd known me since I was a boy, that I was a man of the road, not boardrooms, that Dad wanted me to have a place where I could finally breathe, where I could escape all the stress and paperwork and corporate nonsense, that these legal documents, all these contracts and bylaws and shareholder agreements, they were a cage. But that land, that was freedom. That was Dad's final gift, protected me from a world I was never built for. Here's the thing about poison. Sometimes it comes in a medicine bottle. Sometimes it's delivered with a smile and a hand on your shoulder. Sometimes it's wrapped up as protection, as love, as concern for your well-being. I stared at those papers, at the maps showing this land in Texas, at the photographs of a rusted-out trailer that looked like it had seen better days in the 1970s. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Emily must have seen me hesitating because she stood up and asked if she could talk to me privately. Haynes nodded, said we could use the conference room next door. The conference room had these big windows overlooking the parking lot. Emily stood with her back to them, arms crossed. Chet stayed in the other room, probably checking his stocks or whatever it is people like him do. What Emily said next, I remember word for word, not because I recorded it, because some things burn themselves into your memory. She told me to listen carefully. That Dad had built Connolly and Son Logistics from nothing, from a single truck and a dream that was now worth over $30 million, employed 200 people, ran a fleet of 80 trucks across 48 states. That this wasn't some small operation anymore. The world had changed. Trucking had changed. You needed people with MBAs now, people who understood supply chain optimization, people who could analyze data and predict market trends. Then she said it, the part that really cut deep. She told me I'd been turning the same steering wheel for 40 years, that I was their sentimental connection to the past. But the past doesn't pay the bills. That while I was a great driver, maybe even the best they'd ever had, driving wasn't managing. That I should take the land, think about Dad, remember the good times, and not get in the way of people who actually knew how to run a modern business. I want you to understand something. This wasn't some angry outburst. Emily wasn't yelling. Her voice was calm, measured, almost kind, like she was explaining something to a child, like she was doing me a favor by being so honest. That's what made it worse. If she'd been angry, if she'd been cruel, I could have fought back. But this was clinical. This was a professional execution. This was my sister telling me that everything I had dedicated my life to meant nothing in the grand scheme of their business. Chet wasn't my nephew in that moment. He was a replacement, a better version, the version with the right credentials, the right education, the right way of thinking. I stood there looking out that window, watching cars drive by, normal people living normal lives, and I felt something break inside me. Not dramatically. Not like in movies where someone falls to their knees. Just this quiet crack, like wood splitting. I walked back into Haynes's office, picked up the pen. My hand was steady. Funny how that works. Your whole world can be falling apart, and your hand doesn't shake. The pen felt heavier than any wrench I'd ever held. Heavier than any load I'd ever secured. I signed next to the little red tabs, marking where I needed to sign, one after another. Initial here, signature there, date this, witness that. Chet smiled. Small smile, barely visible, but I saw it. He extended his hand for a handshake. I left him hanging, walked right past him, past Emily, past Haynes with his concerned expression and his gentle lies. Outside, I could see the parking lot of Connolly and Son Logistics next door. Some worker was up on a ladder, removing the old sign. The one that had hung there since 1985. Connolly and Son Logistics, with the little road graphic and the vintage truck design Dad had been so proud of. They were taking it down. I got in my Ford F-150. Bought it used in 2010, had 200,000 miles on it. Ran like a dream because I maintained it myself. Started the engine and pulled out of that parking lot. Watched everything disappear in my rear view mirror. Ahead of me was Interstate 40 West, and at the end of that road, somewhere in West Texas, was 160 acres of dirt, a trailer that probably had rats, and absolutely nothing else. Dad used to say something when I was a kid, back when I complained about hauling an empty trailer. He'd tell me the heaviest load isn't the full one, it's the empty one, because emptiness weighs on your soul in a way cargo never can. I understood what he meant now. I'd spent 40 years hauling freight across this country, pulled everything from steel beams to furniture, from electronics to food supplies. Never once felt like I was carrying nothing. But driving away from that office, heading toward that empty piece of land with that empty trailer waiting for me, that was the heaviest haul of my life. Because I wasn't just empty. I was the empty trailer. I was the thing with nothing left inside, rolling down the highway toward nowhere. The drive took 16 hours. I stopped once for gas and a bad cup of coffee at some truck stop outside Amarillo. Didn't sleep. Didn't eat. Just drove. West Texas looks like the surface of Mars if Mars was slightly more depressing. Flat, brown, endless. The kind of place where you can see for miles and there's nothing worth seeing. Occasional mesquite trees twisted like they were trying to escape the ground. Dirt roads leading to more dirt. The GPS took me off the highway, down a county road, then down what could generously be called a path. My truck bounced over ruts and rocks. No mailbox. No sign. Just an opening in a barbed wire fence that sagged like it had given up decades ago. And there it was. My inheritance. The trailer was a 1970s model, one of those single wides that people used to think were temporary housing until they became permanent. Rust had claimed most of the skirting. The windows were covered with aluminum foil on the inside, probably to keep out the heat. The door hung crooked on its hinges. There was a propane tank, empty by the look of it. A satellite dish from the 1980s pointed at the sky, like a prayer that was never answered. And everywhere, just everywhere, was dirt. Brown, dry, lifeless dirt. I turned off the engine. Silence hit me like a physical thing. Out here, there was no traffic noise, No distant sirens. No hum of civilization. Just wind. The wind made this whistling sound as it blew through the gaps in the trailer's siding, through the rusted wheel wells, through the spaces where the metal had corroded away. I got out of my truck, stood there. The sun was setting, turning the sky orange and purple, which would have been beautiful anywhere else. Here it just made the emptiness more obvious. This was it. This was what I'd traded $5 million for. This was freedom, according to Haynes. This was Dad's special gift. I walked up to the trailer door, pulled it open. It scraped against a concrete block that served as a step. Inside smelled like dust and mouse droppings in time. And I was alone, completely, utterly alone. The wind picked up, making that whistling sound louder, like the land itself was mocking me. I stood in the doorway of that rusted trailer and realized that everything I'd built, everything I'd worked for, every mile I'd driven, and every load I'd delivered had led me here. To nothing, to nowhere, to the end of the road. 3 months later, I was on my knees in the dirt, trying to fix a water pump that had given up on life sometime during the previous decade. The pump was older than most people's cars, held together with wire, duct tape, and what I can only describe as spite. I'd already stripped 2 bolts trying to get the housing open, and my knuckles were bleeding from where I'd slipped with a wrench. The Texas sun beat down like it had a personal grudge against me specifically. My savings account had dwindled to about $800, maybe less. I'd stopped checking because knowing the exact number just made it worse. Breakfast was canned beans. Lunch was canned beans. Dinner was canned beans with hot sauce if I was feeling fancy. I discovered that the Dollar General in the nearest town, 47 miles away, sold dented cans at half price. Dented meant the label was torn or the can had a ding, but the food inside was fine. Probably fine. Good enough. The beer was cheap too. Not the kind you drink because you enjoy it. The kind you drink because it's wet and it makes you forget that you're 58 years old, living in a rusted trailer, eating beans out of damaged cans. The water pump finally gave up completely around 2 in the afternoon. Just seized. No amount of wire or prayer was going to fix it. I sat back on my heels, wiped the sweat from my face with a greasy hand, and seriously considered just walking out into the desert until the heat or the snakes got me. Would have been quicker than this slow death by humiliation. That's when I saw the dust cloud on the road. Out here, any vehicle approaching is an event. You see the dust long before you see what's causing it. This particular cloud was moving slow, methodical, official. Sheriff's cruiser pulled up about 20 feet from my trailer. Deputy actually. Young guy, probably early 30s, with that uncomfortable expression cops get when they have to deliver bad news to someone who clearly doesn't need more bad news. He got out, adjusted his belt in that way all cops do, and walked over. Handed me an envelope without meeting my eyes. Legal notice. Someone had filed a complaint about illegal waste storage on my property. Specifically, my truck was leaking oil onto the ground, creating an environmental hazard. I had 30 days to remediate the situation, or face fines up to $5,000 per day. I stared at the paper, then at the oil stain under my Ford. It was about the size of a dinner plate. In 40 years of trucking, I'd seen parking lots with oil stains you could swim in. The deputy shuffled his feet, told me he was sorry, but he had to serve the notice. Asked if I understood my rights and responsibilities as outlined in the document. I looked at him, then at the oil stain, then back at him, told him that oil stain counted as waste. Then my truck was a piece of modern art, called it tears of a V8 engine. Asked him if he thought it would sell at a gallery in Austin. He almost smiled. Almost. Then he got back in his cruiser and drove away, leaving me with a $5,000 per day problem and exactly $0 to solve it. That evening, I pulled out the legal notice again. Read it more carefully this time. The complaint had been filed by a law firm, not just any law firm, the same one that represented Connolly and Son Logistics, Chet's firm. They weren't done with me. Kicking me out of the company wasn't enough. They wanted me gone from the land too, wanted me to have nothing, to be nothing. This petty little notice, this joke of complaint about an oil stain in the middle of nowhere, was designed to do one thing, break me. make me sell the land for pennies just to escape, make me disappear. I sat in that trailer, with the propane lamp hissing, because I couldn't afford electricity, and felt something shift inside me. Not hope, exactly. More like anger, the useful kind. The kind that keeps you moving when everything else says stop. If they wanted me gone, they were going to have to try harder than some environmental complaint about a truck that leaked less than a leaky faucet. I started pulling trash out of the trailer. Old newspapers, broken furniture, boxes of junk that had been accumulating since the 70s. My plan was simple. Burn it all. Start fresh. If I was going to live in this metal coffin, at least it would be a clean metal coffin. One of the boxes was heavier than it should have been. Metal. When I opened it, I found tools. Old tools, the kind they made before planned obsolescence became a business model. Wrenches that actually fit the bolts they were designed for. Screwdrivers with wooden handles worn smooth from use. My grandfather's tools. Underneath the tools was a folded map. The paper was so old it felt like cloth, yellowed and brittle at the edges. Geological survey from the 1950s. Someone, probably Grandpa, had marked it up with notes in circles and question marks. There were also 3 journals. Composition notebooks. The cheap kind with the black and white marble pattern on the cover. The pages were filled with handwriting in pencil, faded but still readable. I'd never been much of a reader, but that night, with nothing else to do and nowhere else to be, I sat down at the wobbly table and started going through them. The journals were basically Grandpa's work logs. He'd been a wildcatter back in the 50s and 60s, drilling test wells for oil companies. Most of the entries were boring. Depths, formations, drilling times. The kind of technical stuff that would put most people to sleep, but every now and then, he'd write something personal. Little observations about the land, about what he saw and smelled and tasted. One entry from 1957. Water here tastes like battery acid. Driller says that's normal for this area. I say it's not. Another from 1958. Ground smells like sulfur after rain. Boss says I'm imagining things. I'm not. A third entry from 1959. Brought my old compass out here today. Damn thing started spinning like it couldn't make up its mind. Mineral deposit maybe. Company boys said there's nothing here worth finding. They're looking for oil. But land's trying to tell me something different. I read through all 3 journals twice. The entries were scattered across years, different locations, random observations that didn't seem to connect to anything. But something about them bothered me, like that feeling you get when you know you're forgetting something important, but can't remember what. I spread the geological map out on the table, found my property boundaries, marked them with a pencil. Then I started going back through the journals, looking for any entry that mentioned a location I could identify. Any landmark, any road, any reference point that still existed. Found 3. 3 entries with enough detail that I could pin them down on the map. I didn't have proper map markers, so I used what I had. Spent bullet casings from the .30-06 I brought with me. Put them on the map where each entry seemed to be describing. First casing, battery acid water. Second casing, sulfur smell. Third casing, crazy compass. I stood up, looked at the map from a few feet back. The 3 casings formed a triangle. Not perfect, but close enough that it couldn't be coincidence. And all 3 points were on my land. Now, I didn't know anything about geology. Couldn't tell you the difference between shale and sandstone if my life depended on it. Never heard the word lithium outside of batteries in a hardware store. But I'd spent 40 years reading signs on a highway. Exit markers, warning signs, mile markers. You learn to recognize patterns. Learn to see when things line up in ways that mean something. This was a pattern. These weren't random observations scattered across West Texas. These were markers. Road signs pointing to something specific. Something Grandpa had noticed but didn't understand. Something the oil companies had missed because they were looking for the wrong thing. I stared at that triangle for a long time. The propane lamp flickered, throwing shadows across the map. In trucking, we have this saying, if 3 things break on the same truck in the same week, it's not bad luck. It's a message. The truck is trying to tell you something. The land was trying to tell me something. I just needed to figure out what. The next morning, I dug through my old address book. The pages were stained with coffee and grease, held together with rubber bands. Found the number I was looking for. Vernon Hayes. We'd served together in Vietnam. He'd been a combat engineer, the guy who could build a bridge or blow one up depending on what the day required. After the war, he'd gone into drilling. Last I heard, he was running a small operation out of New Mexico. The phone rang 6 times before he picked up. His voice was older, rougher, but still Vernon. I told him who I was. There was a pause. Then he laughed and asked if I was calling to return the $20 I'd borrowed in Saigon in 1971. We caught up for a few minutes. The kind of surface-level catching up that old soldiers do, carefully avoiding the things that still wake us up at 3 in the morning. Then I told him why I was really calling. His response was about what I expected. He asked if I'd found a treasure map. Wanted to know if I had a parrot on my shoulder and an eye patch. But I didn't ask him for money. Didn't try to sell him on some wild scheme. I just reminded him about Saigon, about the time the generator broke during the rainy season, and I'd fixed it using a fork and some wire because we didn't have the right parts. Told him I needed one favor. 24 hours. Just one day. I had a puzzle I couldn't ignore, even if I didn't know the answer yet. If my fork solution didn't work this time, I'd never bother him again. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Vernon told me he'd be there in 3 days. Said he must be getting soft in his old age. Told me I'd better have beer, even if it was cheap beer. I hung up and stared at that map again, at the triangle formed by 3 bullet casings, at my grandfather's faded handwriting describing things he saw, but couldn't explain. Maybe I was crazy. Maybe I was so desperate that I was seeing patterns that didn't exist, like seeing faces in clouds. But desperation has a way of sharpening your senses. When you've got nothing left to lose, you start noticing things you missed before. Vernon showed up on a Thursday with a drilling rig that looked almost as old as my trailer. The truck hauling it was held together with welds and hope. He climbed out, stretched his back, and looked around at the emptiness. Asked me if I'd picked this location specifically for the scenic views, or if I just spun a globe and pointed at the most depressing spot I could find. I told him West Texas won the lottery fair and square. He'd brought someone with him. Kid in his early 20s, skinny, with those thick-framed glasses that young people wear now. Looked like a strong breeze would knock him over. Vernon introduced him as Tommy something, recent geology graduate who couldn't find work because nobody wanted to hire someone without experience. But nobody would give him experience without hiring him first. The kid was so nervous, he dropped his laptop bag twice while getting out of the truck. Vernon told me Tommy was working for food and references. I told Tommy all I had was dented cans of beans. Kid said that was fine. He'd been living on ramen for 6 months, so beans would be an upgrade. I brought out the map and the journals, spread them on the hood of Vernon's truck. Tommy started reading through the entries, occasionally typing notes into his laptop. At first, he was just being polite, going through the motions. But then his typing got faster, more intense. He pulled up some kind of database on his screen, cross-referenced Grandpa's observations with geological data, started muttering to himself about pH levels and mineral indicators and electromagnetic anomalies. Finally, he looked up at me. His hands were shaking slightly. Told me my grandfather had been describing, without knowing it, classic signs of lithium sulfide brine. Said the crazy compass was particularly significant because it suggested magnetic anomalies associated with certain mineral deposits. Vernon leaned over, squinting at the laptop screen like it might bite him. Asked Tommy to translate that into English for the old guys. Tommy took a breath, explained that everything Grandpa had written down, all those weird observations about taste and smell and magnetic fields, they were exactly what modern geologists look for when surveying for lithium deposits. I looked at that triangle on the map, at the 3 bullet casings marking spots my grandfather had noticed 70 years ago. Vernon asked Tommy what the odds were. What were the chances this was real? Tommy pushed his glasses up his nose and admitted he didn't know. Said he was fresh out of college and had never actually done a real survey in the field. But based on the historical data and Grandpa's observations, he thought there was a legitimate possibility. Vernon looked at me, asked if I was sure about this, reminded me that drilling wasn't cheap, and coming up dry would mean I'd waste his time and my last shot of hope. I pointed to the center of the triangle, the exact spot where all three of Grandpa's markers intersected. Told him to drill there. Vernon shook his head, called me the stubbornest man he'd ever met, and started unloading the drilling rig. Tommy set up his equipment, took readings, made calculations, marked the exact spot with a stake and some orange tape. The drill bit was old, scarred from years of chewing through rock. Vernon fired up the engine, and it roared to life with a sound like thunder. The bit touched the ground, started spinning, bit into the dry Texas earth with a screech of metal on stone. I stood there, holding my grandfather's compass, the same one that had gone crazy 70 years ago. In my hand, it was steady, pointing north like it was supposed to. But as the drill went deeper, pushing through layers of limestone and shale, I could have sworn the needle twitched, just slightly, like the earth itself was responding to what we were doing. Vernon wiped sweat from his face and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Skepticism, maybe, or concern that he'd driven 3 days to help a desperate man chase ghosts. The drill bit deeper, deeper. The sound changed as it hit different layers. Harder rock, softer sediment, clay, sand. Tommy watched his instruments, occasionally calling out depths and formations. Vernon kept drilling, and I stood there, holding that compass, watching the needle, and wondering if I was about to prove my grandfather was a genius, or if I was about to confirm that I'd lost everything, including my mind. The drill screamed into the earth. The sound echoed across the empty desert. And somewhere deep below, past the surface layer of disappointment and desperation, past the rock and stone and sand, the land held its secrets close, waiting to see if we were worthy of knowing them. For the first 4 hours, we got nothing but dust and disappointment. The drill bit chewed through layers of limestone and clay, bringing up samples that Tommy analyzed with increasingly nervous glances at Vernon. Dry rock, dead formations, nothing that suggested we were anywhere close to what Grandpa's journals had hinted at. Vernon checked his watch for the 3rd time in 10 minutes, asked me if I was sure about the location, reminded me that his rig wasn't getting any younger, and neither was he. I told him to keep drilling. Around hour 5, the bit suddenly dropped, just fell through whatever it had been grinding against. The drill lurched, and Vernon had to fight to keep it steady. Then we heard it, a sound like a tire blowing out, followed by a geyser of water, shooting up to the borehole with enough pressure to knock Tommy off his feet. Water, clear, cold water, spraying 15 feet into the air and turning the dry Texas dirt into mud. Vernon killed the drill and stood there staring. Finally spat into the dirt and shook his head, told me congratulations. We'd found water in the desert. Said maybe I could sell it to tourists in little bottles with pictures of cacti on them. But Tommy was already scrambling for his testing kit, slipping in the mud, glasses fogged up from the spray. He managed to catch some of the water in a sample bottle, added some kind of chemical that turned it blue, then orange, then a color I didn't have a name for. The kid's hands were shaking when he looked up at us. He said it wasn't just water. This was an artesian well, tapped directly into the Ogallala Aquifer in West Texas, where water rights were worth more than most people's houses. We just hit the equivalent of a lottery jackpot. Vernon looked at me, then at the fountain of water still spraying into the desert air, then back at me, asked if I'd planned this or if I was just the luckiest desperate man in Texas. I didn't have an answer. I was too busy watching that water, clear as glass, pouring out of ground that shouldn't have given up anything except dust and regret. Tommy was practically vibrating with excitement now. He told us to wait, that he needed to test the brine. Apparently water this deep often carried dissolved minerals, and based on Grandpa's notes about the battery acid taste, he had a hypothesis. He ran back to Vernon's truck, grabbed more equipment, set up what looked like a miniature chemistry lab in the mud. Vernon and I stood there, both of us thinking the same thing, but neither willing to say it out loud. We'd come looking for something valuable. We'd found water. That was good, better than nothing. But water wasn't going to change my life. Not really. Tommy's laptop beeped. He stared at the screen, blinked, checked his readings again, typed something frantically, looked at the screen again like it might be lying to him. When he finally looked up at us, his face had gone pale. He said we hadn't just found water. The brine analysis showed lithium concentrations that were off the charts. This wasn't just a water source. This was one of the richest lithium deposits in the country, dissolved in the aquifer water, ready to be extracted. I didn't understand what that meant. Not really. Tommy had to explain it like I was 5 years old. Lithium, white gold, the stuff they use in batteries for electric cars, phones, laptops, everything that runs on rechargeable power. The stuff that half the tech companies in the world were scrambling to secure supply chains for. The stuff that countries went to war over. And I was standing on top of what Tommy estimated to be somewhere between $150 and $200 million worth of it. Vernon let out a laugh that sounded more like a cough. Told me I'd gone from broke and desperate to potentially richer than everyone in 3 counties combined. I looked at that fountain of water, still spraying into the air, catching the sunlight and throwing rainbows across the desert. Looked at the mud forming around our feet, the first real moisture this land had probably seen in months. Then I looked at Vernon and told him I guessed tourists would have to buy their water from somewhere else. Maybe we'd call it Connolly's Tears of Joy. He told me I had a terrible sense of humor for a millionaire. The news spread faster than a brush fire in August. I don't know how word got out so quick. Maybe Tommy told someone. Maybe Vernon mentioned it at a bar. Maybe the water company that did the official say couldn't keep their mouths shut. Doesn't matter. Within a week, every news outlet in Texas was running stories about the broke trucker who'd struck it rich. My phone, which hadn't rung in months except for bill collectors, suddenly wouldn't stop buzzing. Reporters, lawyers, investment companies, people claiming to be distant cousins I'd never heard of. And then Emily called. I almost didn't answer. Saw her name on the screen and felt that old anger rise up like bile. But curiosity won out. I wanted to hear what she'd say. Wanted to know how she'd spin this. Her voice was tight, professional. She congratulated me on my discovery, said she was happy for me. Every word sounded like it was being pulled out of her with pliers. Then she told me we needed to talk, face to face. Official business regarding Dad's estate. 2 days later, I got served with legal papers. Again, but this time it wasn't some petty environmental complaint. This was serious. This was Emily, Chet, and their army of lawyers coming at me with everything they had. The lawsuit claimed mutual mistake. Said that when the will was written and when I'd signed the papers, everyone involved believed the land was worthless. Nobody knew about the water or the lithium. The deal had been made under fundamentally wrong assumptions about what was being transferred. They wanted the land deal voided, wanted everything put back into Dad's estate for proper distribution. Their lawyer was Haynes. Of course it was. I read through the filing 3 times, trying to make sense of the legal language. The argument was clever. Insidious, actually. They weren't claiming fraud. They weren't saying anyone lied. They were saying we were all wrong together, and therefore the deal shouldn't count. According to their logic, I'd essentially won the lottery with a ticket I'd gotten through a mistake, and they wanted to cancel that ticket. I needed a lawyer. Good one. Expensive one. The kind I definitely couldn't afford. Spent 2 days calling every attorney in the county. They all said the same thing. Either they were too busy, or they wanted retainers I couldn't pay, or they took one look at who I was up against and suddenly remembered they had conflict of interest. Finally found one who'd meet with me. Sarah Mitchell, young, maybe early 30s. Her office was above an auto repair shop, and the whole place smelled like motor oil and photocopier toner. She listened to my story without interrupting, took notes on a yellow legal pad, the old-fashioned kind. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and looked at me with these sharp eyes that reminded me of a hawk sizing a prey. She told me about her father, how he'd worked 30 years at a manufacturing plant, how the company had been bought out by some corporate entity that decided his experience was outdated, how they'd push him out with a severance package that barely covered 6 months of bills. She said they'd used the same language Emily had used, talked about optimization and efficiency and the need for fresh perspectives. Then she looked at my hands, at the calluses and scars and oil stains that never quite wash out, said she loved cases like this, told me her retainer was $1, said when we won, we'd talk about actual payment, but for now she just wanted to make sure people like her dad, like me, had someone fighting for them. I pulled out my wallet and handed her a dollar bill. She smiled and told me now we were officially in business. Sarah was thorough, scary thorough. She went through every document, every page of Dad's will, every clause and supply use and footnote. Read through Grandpa's journals like they were religious texts. After 3 days, she called me, said she needed to see the journals again, specifically the one from 1958. I brought them to her office. She spread them out on her desk, which was already covered in papers and coffee cups and what looked like the remains of several working dinners. She flipped through the 1958 journal, reading entries carefully, running her finger down the pages. Then she stopped, pointed to an entry. Grandpa had written about some company men showing up, guys in suits who looked like they'd never gotten their hands dirty in their lives. They drilled 2 test holes near the road, barely scratched the surface, then left for lunch and never came back. They'd told Grandpa's father, my great-grandfather, that there was nothing here, just dry rock, not worth their time. But Grandpa had added his own note, said the company men were looking for oil, said they should have been listening to the land instead. Sarah kept flipping, got to the last page of the journal. There, tucked into the binding, was a receipt, yellowed, fragile, but still readable. A certified mail receipt from 1958, sent to my grandfather's son, to my father. The date was 6 months before Dad started Connolly and Son Logistics. The notation said it contained geological survey information and land assessment recommendations. Sarah looked up at me with the expression of someone who just found exactly what they were looking for. She explained what this meant. If Grandpa had sent information to my father about potential value in the land, then Dad knew. Maybe he didn't understand it fully. Maybe he dismissed it as an old man's hunches. But he'd been informed. He'd been warned, which meant Emily and Chet had likely known too. This was Dad's land originally. These were Dad's papers. The mutual mistake argument fell apart if they'd had information, even uncertain information, about potential value. Sarah told me to get ready, said this was going to get ugly, said Emily and her lawyers would fight dirty because they were cornered and desperate. She was right. The next 3 months were a blur of depositions, document reviews, expert testimony. Emily's team brought in geologists who said the lithium deposits were unpredictable and impossible to foresee. We brought in experts who said Grandpa's observations were textbook indicators. They claimed the certified mail receipt was circumstantial. We showed that Dad had kept Grandpa's journals in company storage, meaning he valued them enough to preserve them. The local news picked up the story. Suddenly, I was the blue-collar hero fighting against corporate greed. Emily was a villain trying to steal from her own brother. Chet was a spoiled rich kid who'd never worked a real day in his life. The court of public opinion had made its decision long before the actual court did. I hated every minute of it. Hated seeing my family's dirty laundry aired out for everyone to judge. Hated the reporters shoving cameras in my face every time I went to courthouse. One day, as Sarah and I were walking up the courthouse steps, a reporter called out, asked me what I thought about Emily's statement that I dishonored Dad's memory by fighting the will. I stopped, looked right at the camera, told him my father taught me that lies are the heaviest load you can carry, said we'd soon see who was overloaded. Sarah pulled me away before I could say anything else, told me that was good, but we needed to save it for the courtroom. The trial took 2 weeks. The judge was an old Texas man named Harlan Price, probably in his 70s, who looked like he'd spent most of his life outdoors and didn't have much patience for nonsense. He listened to Emily's lawyers talk about market values and geological surveys and the unpredictability of mineral deposits, watched them present their case with charts and graphs and expert witnesses in expensive suits. Then he listened to Sarah present our case, watched her show Grandpa's journals. The receipt, the pattern of observations that any working man who paid attention to the land would have noticed. Judge Price took one day to make his decision. He ruled in my favor, said that the journals in the receipt showed that the family had been informed, or should have been informed, about potential value in the land, said that ignorance through willful blindness wasn't the same as genuine mutual mistake. Then he added something that made the local papers quote him for weeks. He said that sometimes wisdom written by a callous hand was worth more than any report printed on expensive paper. The land was mine. The water was mine. The lithium was mine. Emily and Chet walked out of that courtroom, looking like they'd been hit by a truck. Haynes tried to maintain his professional composure, but even he looked defeated. Within a month, Connolly & Son Logistics was in serious trouble. The legal fees had been substantial. Chet's management had been poor. They'd lost several major contracts because their delivery times had gotten worse. Their customer service had declined, and word had gotten around that the company was unstable. But the real problem was water. See, in the trucking business, especially in West Texas, water isn't just something you drink. It's something you need for your trucks, for your operations, for your facilities. Most companies had agreements with local water suppliers. I quietly signed an exclusive contract with the biggest agricultural conglomerate in the region, gave them access to my water rights at rates they couldn't refuse. In return, Connolly Logistics found that their usual water supply points were suddenly unavailable. They had to reroute their trucks, adding miles and time to every delivery. In trucking, where margins are measured in pennies per mile, those extra miles killed their profitability. It wasn't just revenge. It was strategy. The kind of strategic thinking that comes from 40 years of understanding how logistics actually work, not how they look on a spreadsheet. 6 months after the trial, Emily called me again. This time her voice was different. No professional polish. No corporate speak. Just exhaustion and desperation. She asked if she could come see me. Needed to talk. Face to face. I told her where to find me. They showed up on a Saturday. Emily and Chet driving a rental car because they'd probably sold everything worth selling to keep the company afloat. The old trailer was gone. In its place was a modest house. Nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, decent kitchen, solid construction. Built by local contractors who did good work for fair prices. Emily looked around at the property like she was seeing it for the first time. The water pump station in the distance. The new road grading. The signs marking it as private property. We sat on my porch. I offered them water, which seemed appropriate. Emily declined. Chet just stared at his shoes. Emily did the talking. Said the company was about to go under. Said they'd tried everything to save it. Said she knew I had no reason to help them, but she was asking anyway. She wasn't asking for money. She was asking for an easement. A right-of-way across my land to access a water station that would save their routes, would save the company. I drank my coffee, let the silence stretch out, watched the truck drive past on the highway in the distance, the sun glinting off its chrome. Finally told them no. No easement. Emily's face crumbled. Chet looked like he might actually cry. Then I told him I had a better offer. I'd buy Connolly & Son Logistics for $1. I'd take on all the debts, all the problems, all the mess they'd made. But I'd do it my way. Emily could keep her job, not as a vice president, as a senior dispatcher. She'd work the phones 24/7, talking to the drivers she'd dismissed as obsolete. She'd handle their complaints, their problems, their scheduling conflicts. She'd learn what the business actually was from the ground up. Chet was fired. Immediately. Permanently. But I'd give him a job if he wanted it. As a driver. On the oldest truck in the fleet. Standard pay, calculated by the mile. Same as every other new driver. I told them Chet had said my heart was on the road. Said I wanted him to feel what that actually meant. Wanted him to understand what it's like to drive 18 hours straight. To sleep in a cab. To eat gas station food, because that's all there is. Told him if he wanted to run the company someday, he needed to learn how to turn a steering wheel first. Emily looked at me like I'd slapped her. Chet looked at the ground. Neither of them said yes. Neither said no. They just left, driving away in their rental car, leaving dust in the air. 3 days later, Emily called, said she'd take the dispatcher job, said she'd start Monday. Chet never called. Last I heard, he moved to Dallas, took a job at some consulting firm, probably telling other people how to run their businesses without ever getting his own hands dirty. Some people never learn. 6 months after that, I was sitting on my porch at sunset. The house was quiet. The desert was peaceful. A truck drove past, one of ours, with a new logo, Connolly and Son Logistics, redesigned but still recognizable. The driver honked. I waved, recognized him as one of the old-timers who'd been with Dad since the 80s. My phone rang. CEO of a mining corporation that was developing the lithium deposits. Started talking about million-dollar contracts, expansion plans, quarterly projections. I interrupted him, told him to hold on, said my coffee was getting cold, and the sun was setting, and both of those things were more important than his quarterly projections. Told him to call me tomorrow. Hung up before he could respond. I'd spent 40 years on other people's schedules, driving when they told me to drive, stopping when they told me to stop, living by the rhythm of delivery deadlines and dispatch orders. Not anymore. I picked up my coffee mug, watched the sun sink toward the horizon, turning the Texas sky into something beautiful. The kind of beautiful you only appreciate when you've earned the right to sit still and watch it. I hadn't become a billionaire in a high-rise, hadn't transformed into some corporate titan. I was still me, still wearing jeans and work boots, still had calluses on my hands and motor oil under my fingernails. But now I was me on my own terms. The land had given up its secrets. The water flowed. The lithium waited to be extracted. The company my father built was back in the family hands, being run the right way. Emily was learning what real work looked like. The drivers were getting the respect they deserved. The trucks rolled on schedule. And I was home. Not the house I'd grown up in. Not the trailer I'd inherited. Not even the modest place I'd built. Home was this moment, this sunset, this choice to let the phone ring, and the coffee cool, and the business wait until tomorrow. Dad used to say the road was freedom. He was half right. Freedom wasn't the road. Freedom was knowing when to stop driving, when to pull over, when to turn off the engine, and just sit with the silence. I raised my coffee mug to the sunset, to Grandpa and his journals, to Dad and his complicated legacy, to Vernon and his trust, to Sarah and her $1 retainer, to Tommy and his geology degree that finally meant something, to everyone who'd ever been told they were obsolete, outdated, past their prime. The land hadn't forgotten its worth. The old knowledge hadn't become useless. The callous hands still knew how to read signs that educated eyes missed. Sometimes the world changes so fast that people forget the basics. Forget that water is wealth. Forget that the land tells stories if you listen. Forget that experience isn't obsolete just because it's old. My phone buzzed again. Another call. Another opportunity. Another person who wanted something from me. I silenced it, took another sip of coffee, watched the sun finally slip below the horizon. Tomorrow I'd answer the calls. Tomorrow I'd run the business. Tomorrow I'd deal with contracts and lawyers and all the complications that came with success. But tonight, I was just Mike Connolly, 58 years old, Vietnam vet, truck driver, lucky man who listened to his grandfather's journals and trusted his gut. The stars started coming out. Desert stars, bright and clear without city lights to drown them out. I thought about Emily in her new position, probably overwhelmed and exhausted, finally understanding what real work felt like. I thought about Chet in Dallas, probably still convinced he'd been right all along. I thought about Haynes, who'd learned that betraying trust had consequences. Mostly, though, I thought about Dad, wondered if he'd be proud or angry or both. He'd wanted to protect me, in his own way, even if his protection looked like betrayal, even if his plan backfired spectacularly. Maybe he'd known all along. Maybe those journals weren't just stored by accident. Maybe he'd left me a puzzle to solve, a path to follow, a way to prove myself. Or maybe he genuinely thought I was too simple for the business world, too stuck in the past, too much of the old way. Didn't matter now. The past was done. The paper had tried to bury me, but the stone, the land, the earth itself had other plans. Rock beats paper. Always has. Always will. I finished my coffee, stood up, stretched my back, feeling all 58 years in my joints and muscles. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new problems, new people trying to take what I'd fought for. But tonight, standing on my porch, looking at my land, breathing the desert air that tasted like dust and possibility, tonight I'd won. Not just the case, not just the money. I'd won myself back. And that, more than any deposit of lithium or flow of water or verdict from a judge, was worth everything. The wind picked up, whistling through the desert like it had that first night when I'd arrived broken and defeated. But this time, it didn't sound like morning. It sounded like coming home.